about education, and of course, the focus is on putting the most marginalized children at the core of the concept on building back better in education. I wanted to start by saying that, at least from the perspective of UNICEF, we take education as a human rights issue. It is a justice issue, and we look at it as the greatest equalizer. If you put all kids in a school which is offering equal opportunities, no matter their background, that's the greatest equalizer you can have in terms of achieving the right to education. So what we have seen is the impact of COVID has actually exacerbated the inequalities that were there previously, even before COVID. We know that even before COVID, we had over 250,000 children out of school, most of them, of course, from sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, and of course, in conflict and crisis affected countries. And also, over 500,000 learners were actually not acquiring the basic minimum proficiencies required in literacy and maths. So we had a crisis before COVID, and this crisis has just been exacerbated. Throughout this crisis, we know that governments have been trying to keep learners continuing learning and continuing accessing their education. Different modalities have been used, most of which have actually relied on technology, and we have seen that most of the governments actually implemented online learning. There were some that implemented TV, there were some that implemented radio. But even with all that effort, over 463 million learners were actually not reached during this period. It means they totally missed out. And the characteristics of these learners were mostly those in rural areas, those in the most poorest communities. We had regional discrepancies, of course, sub-Saharan Africa faring the worst in that regard, but also limitations in terms of pre-primary school. That was the group of learners that were least reached in this particular period. In UNICEF, we have been trying to monitor how governments and stakeholders are planning for reopening of schools. As we are hearing, most governments are actually reopening schools, and we are trying to track what they are doing to put those most marginalized groups at the center. There's a little bit of some measure to put systems in place. And when I'm talking 74%, I'm talking to about 150 countries where UNICEF is actually present, and not all the countries in the world. So you can see that that is quite a challenge. So while some measures are being put in place, gaps are still there. And only about 500,000 had done at least one measure to try and put the most marginalized girls into the reopening plans, meaning that we still have a significant gap there. And we know that COVID has hit girls disproportionately. We learned from Ebola, high rises in teenage pregnancy, early marriages, and without any specified targets, those girls are going to continue to fare badly in education. And UNICEF has also been engaged in advocacy to ensure inclusion and equity, and highlighting those messages in the campaigns to bring back learners to school. So we are putting efforts in investing in communication, community mobilization, and sensitization to try and make sure that those groups that are at risk of not coming back to school should actually be reached with these messages and should actually be supported to get back to school. That slide just talks to some of the measures to ensure inclusion in the different countries, and also the level of preparedness. How have countries fared in terms of ensuring that critical messages reach the most marginalized populations and in the languages that they understand, including languages that are friendly to children with disabilities? How have we integrated gender-based violence, sexual reproductive health, nutrition, health, literacy to vaccinations as we reopen schools? How have we looked at issues of mental health, psychosocial support? We know the impact that COVID has had in that regard on families, but also specific tailored campaigns to girls, out of school learners, children with disabilities, but also just to address the measures that will pose the greatest barriers in terms of enrollment, which are mostly in this case economic measures. So that graph just really talks to the significant challenges that are still there, and just a few highlights in terms of the green of countries that are actually doing well. My last slide there, what are we doing? What are we pushing for in terms of policy reforms and putting in place systems to ensure that marginalized learners actually are not left behind? We are saying you need to expand inclusive remote learning strategies. We obviously know that there's going to probably be recurrence of this pandemic, and we need to look at blended learning approaches. But in doing that, you make sure that you address the digital divide between girls and boys, between the poorest and the richest, and the rural and urban. Expand access, open beta, but also open wider by expanding access to those that were actually previously out of school before even COVID, and making sure there's a flexibility in that regard. Addressing the learning crisis, focus on foundational literacy, maths, and reading, so that at least learners can be able to catch up on the learning loss that they have actually experienced during this time when they were not participating in online learning. Equity financing, put resources where they matter most by targeting those populations that are left behind. And I've talked about these particular groups. So we're pushing governments to ensure that their finances actually target those groups. Invest in gender transformative education and analyze, have evidence, and invest in that regard. And of course, we have seen that there's a critical role for parents and caregivers that we need to include in this particular regard. So I'll stop there and hope to engage in further discussions during the Q&A and the breakaway rooms. Thank you.